Hi BookTube. I thought I would do a video on translators and the hate that they get. I will keep this discussion fairly straightforward and simple. I won't get too much into the details because it's a huge topic. There's so many different elements that can go into this. So basically, my focus is readers and our attitudes towards translators. There's a huge difference between just picking up a book and picking up a translated work. When we pick up a normal book, we just decide, is this a good book? What's the plot line? Sounds interesting, and then we buy it. Maybe we'll take a look at the language and see, yeah, the language is real pretty or something like this. Like we don't have a lot of the extreme criticalness that we have once we pick up a translated work. If it's a contemporary one that only has one available, we would probably just pick it up again because the story is interesting, or the country is something we want to read a book from. But if we get into reading a classic that's been translated, suddenly there's this real strong attitude of disdain, and even entitlement starts to come into play, as if our reading is more important than the 10 or 20 years it took the translator to produce this work. It's just something that's really unique with translated works. Even I've done this. I'll get into some examples, but it's just a real strong difference between the two. So a lot of this disdain or entitlement, or I think it all comes from fear, where our motive for this is we're reading something that's widely regarded, that's considered really important, a pinnacle of someone's culture or part of culture, some time frame in history, and we just think, I want to get a really good understanding, and I want to have the true story, how the author intended it. That's often where we're coming from when we begin to consider different translations and decide which one is better, which one's highly regarded, which one's widely celebrated, all these kinds of things. And fair enough, we should be validated in that, but it's that there is still that initial step where we do consider the translator as getting in the way of our enjoyment of a text, or we consider the translator as being like a gatekeeper towards getting in the way of our access to that text. Like they filter the original language and they provide us with maybe their own biases is what we're worried about. And all of these, they're all fair enough, absolutely. That brings me to my next point about, I've been watching a lot of Anthony Pim's channel. I'll put the links in. There's two videos in particular where this next part of my video, a lot of my ideas came from. Just from watching his stuff. I'll put the links in. One is basically the available work for translators today, and the other one is the deprofessionalization of translation. So the two ideas, they are connected. If you have the time and if you're really interested, I really highly recommend watching those two videos. He gives a very relevant current view of what's happening in the translation world today. And so Anthony Pim says there's 333,000 translators, full-time translators in the world today. That's for the whole entire planet. And he says those numbers, you can't really believe them because data and different opinions and stuff, and what's considered a full-time versus part-time or freelancer. Generally, he says that there's more freelancers or part-time translators than full-time ones. And he gets into a lot of the details, and those details are different and they vary from country to country. And it just makes the whole field a lot more like the Wild Wild West in terms of being unstandardized and being just literally where the translator, the person who knows the target language and the native language, the person who knows the target language and the original language, that person is the translator, and that person could just be a freelance person who has an ability in both languages, and they have to use their own judgment and their own language expertise to convert a text from one language into another. And the people who are actually on staff at whatever institution, those are the people who are like the administration, who do the payroll, who have the MA in translation, and they're hired to be responsible for a text to be translated into a different language. So that person has to find someone who knows the two languages, and they will employ that person and hire them, and that person is the one who actually does the physical converting of a text from one language to another. And then, I mean, you could get into the different people who are involved if someone else is actually doing quality control or something like this. But that's getting into a whole different field that is outside the scope of this one video. Generally speaking, translation is the wild, wild west. That field right now is just absolutely wild and untamed, I guess. And Europe, you would think, is really good for translation, has a standardized practice and everything. But Pim actually says that's not the case. He says Canada is the only country in the world that has a standardized practice of translation. And I think it's possible Canada is the only country, or one of the few countries, that has the two languages, English and French, and there's basically an equal sign between the two. This is the English word equals that French word. This word equals that English word, and that's it. It's very codified and regular and standardized. And other languages around the world, a lot of it is left up to the interpretation of the translator. And then that's where you can get into their language abilities and biases and ethics and that type of thing, which is also another video and another topic. And so because there's so few full-time people and it's not very well regular, it's not, this kind of thing, that gets into the deprofessionalization of this practice, of this discipline, which is translation. So you get a lot more freelancers. Those are the people who are dominating the job market right now, and part-timers, and people, I guess maybe contract people who are hired, translate this text, and they translate it and they're paid, and then they go off to whatever other job they have that will pay their bills. And that again gets into another topic where we are living in a globalized world where it is more common. I mean, just look at BookTube. How many people around the world are on BookTube right now? How many different languages do they speak? And most of them are doing their BookTube channels in English because they can reach a wider audience than in their native language. And maybe they have two channels, one for English and one for their native language. And that's interesting. So translation obviously is becoming more important, and I think it should be kept as a professional profession. And academia, when they work with translators, the translator is still a specialist. They're a specialist in two different languages, and they are providing a service. We go to professionals in all kinds of different things. We go to a professional hairdresser, we go to a professional carpenter, mechanic. We have all these different professions. Heart surgery is a profession. You don't want to go to an amateur for heart surgery or brain surgery. Professionals are really important, and having a standardized code of ethics and having the profession standardized raises it to a higher level, and the quality of work would be a lot better. So that gets into the professionalized part of it. So to get into how does all of this apply to us as a reader? Because that's essentially what we're concerned with on BookTube. I might have to split this into a couple different videos, but so if the practice is becoming a lot more deprofessionalized, and we have all these freelance people who are translating, like the subtitles, for example, on movies. I know with my husband, it's just a lot of times when we were in Korea, he would actually do a lot of the searching for movies in the Korean language, And then the people who would subtitle it are just, you know, someone who's practicing learning the language, or just someone who just wants to get into translation, possibly. And so the subtitles, the quality of the subtitles would vary quite a bit. And Pim, he does touch on that briefly in his video. And if he makes a whole video on it, that would be interesting. It sounds like he wants to get more into learning about that aspect of translation and that part of language learning for the goal of becoming a translator someday. So that's another interesting topic. So if a lot of the translators are just freelance people who are doing this because of a love of sharing two different cultures, that's fantastic. And if they're translating contemporary works, like I only own 2 contemporary works that are in translation. This one was translated by Lola Rogers. She's a really common translator for Finnish works. It's Compartment Number 6. I still haven't read this yet, but I will get to it. And then the other one is The Librarian, and the translator for this is Andrew Bromfield. So I'm assuming for both of these translations, they're doing this out of a love of the original culture, which would, in this case, would be Finland and the Ukraine. And I mean, the language for The Librarian is fantastic. I mean, it's great. It's wonderful. Yeah, and then what kind of sparked this is actually translators are basically freelance people. That's the majority of the workforce, it sounds like. And they're just doing this out of a pure love of sharing two different cultures. Because I don't think translation would pay a lot. Probably like finding the amount of time you spend finding your next job versus the actual income that you get. It's challenged because you're essentially a business owner. You're running your own company, you're doing your own freelance stuff. And you have to just, because you're going into business, you have to be really professional and you have to show professionalism at all times. And a lot of business is built on reputation. And some translators can actually rise and become widely celebrated and highly regarded for contemporary times. And they probably spend a lot of time just trying to build up that reputation as a reputable translator who's going to give you the best product that they can. And because it's books, the best product means the most accurate, readable translation that's appropriate for the current time. How does all of this apply to us as readers? When we approach a translated work, if we're reading a contemporary work like The Librarian, I think there's only one translation. This was published just a few years ago. Or current books from Finland, Lola Rogers is basically the only translator. And The Librarian, this one was translated by Andrew Bromfield, and this book is from the Ukraine. And Librarian, the translation work for that is exquisite. I think it's beautiful. The language is great and everything. When we have to consider how much work the translator puts into the actual producing the actual text. For the Mahabharat, the translator for this edition is John D. Smith. This is a pretty recent translation for the Mahabharat. The idea came to him, or it was mentioned to him in 1994, and he began the work in 1997, and this was published in 2007, which means maybe he spent 10 years translating it, the better part of 9 or 10 years. And in his introduction, he says he spent 1/5 of his life translating this work. So he did spend a lot of time. Authors, they could spend 10 years writing an actual book and it's their original ideas. He put a lot of work into this, but it's from a slightly different point of view. His point of view is basically recreating the text, but in a new language. So he's not creating something new in terms of, oh, I'm gonna have this happen as a plot point. He's not doing that. He's trying to synthesize the ideas and take the ideas from the original language and how do I represent these same ideas into English, and do I want to bring over the meter and the form and poetry and those types of things. So my point is he does spend 10 years on that one book. So what would his what rights would he have to the book in terms of profit or intellectual rights to it? Because that is the copyright, getting into the copyright and stuff, that's kind of outside this video also. But another one is Belly, Petersburg by Andre Belly. It is translated by David McDuff. And the reason I picked up Petersburg is because Russian people would feel that so much of this book relies on knowing the original Russian language. So maybe it's untranslatable in terms of bringing ideas across cultures, using language to do that. And that's possible. So if that's the case, then there's no point to reading translated works. But obviously I disagree with that, because there is still value in it. Even though I don't understand the Russian language, there is that aspect when you are picking up translated work that some of it will be lost in translation, which is obviously another video. And when you get into classics, that's where things get interesting. That's where that disdain comes in, and that I want the original of it. So when I read Homer's The Iliad, this one is the Lattimore translation, I made a comment on Goodreads where I said that Fagles was dull. I found the language was really dull. In my opinion, I felt it didn't match the story. It felt too contemporary, the language, and obviously he's a contemporary translator today. So he could either try to make the book appropriate, linguagely appropriate for contemporary people today. So you could update the language and make it easier for people to read nowadays, which would mean that it would have a wider appeal. More people would read it, and more people can possibly get into the older language of it. So it's, I mean, I absolutely take that back. I should not have said that it was dull. It could have just been myself. It could have been just my frame of mind when I was reading it at the time. But I mean, he could have spent 30 years translating that, and I just crushed it in just a few sentences, saying that it was dull. I mean, that's crazy. There is a group on Goodreads now, which is just a fabulous group. It is Homer's The Odyssey, translated by Emily Wilson, and that whole group is devoted to reading the Odyssey in various translations and comparing them to each other, comparing the English translations to each other, which I think is a fabulous idea. So actually, I do want to reread the Iliad, or compare it to different languages, and I do want to just kind of, read different people's opinions on that, in those threads on that Goodreads group, and just kind of see how other people feel about the different translations, because it's just something that's interesting to me. And after my Ulysses Wednesday project is done, I do plan on starting this one, where I'm going to go chapter by chapter through Crime and Punishment in these two different translations, because what I said about Fagles, a Russian literature student said about Garnet, and I read Garnet's biography, and I'm enamored with her. She just had a strong passion for translating. That's why she did it. It was just purely out of love. And she translated as much as she possibly humanly could in her lifetime. By the end of her lifetime, she was going blind, and she was still actively translating. She was translating with the help of two other people, and she was the intermediary between the two, where they would read the Russian text and then she would translate it into English, and then it would be written down. So, I mean, if that's not love, I mean, what else could be? And so, I mean, when I read this, I loved it. I thought it was great. This book is actually what started my passion for Russian lit. And there's a lot of disdain towards Piver and Volkonsky. So I'm going to just translate the two of them, language by language. I'm just going to read both of them and I'm going to translate them. I'm just going to read both of them and I'm going to just do a chat through chapter by chapter on the themes and some kind of style differences between the two. And yeah, so what are some solutions? What can be your takeaway from this video? Pick up the translated work and just read it, and try to not be too worried or too stressed about how accurate the translation is, because if we just consider translators with so much disdain, the profession is going to become more and more difficult for them, and they're going to have more and more pressure towards translation and that work, that they might have to just get like some regular 9-to-5 job that's not in their passion. That, who knows if some of these translators, if they're working at like, I don't know, telephone company or in a store and they're just translating on the evenings or weekends, that would mean that they're really tired and they can't put 100% of their energy towards translating. They can only put whatever energy they have left, which it's just it becomes a cycle. So I guess that's my main point for this whole entire video, is just if we change our opinions towards translators and we just step back and we just relax a little bit on it, there is a lot more. They can breathe. It gives them room to breathe, and it can possibly just make this whole entire practice and discipline become more respected in its field, which would mean that they would have more job security, possibly higher pay, and there's probably a lot of work to be done in terms of creating a dual language system where this equals that and this equals that, and it could take a lot of pressure off the translator, and it could make their job more mechanical possibly. Or if you get into, Google Translate and stuff like that and trying to replace them with a machine. Linguistics have been trying to do that for generations, but there's always going to be that human aspect of translating, and reading a book that was translated by a robot versus translated by a human being, it's going to have a different feel to it. It's going to have that human quality to it, because a translator, when they do create this language they do create this book in a new language, they are putting part of themselves into the work, and I'm sure some of those biases are going to creep into the work, and so you are reading some of that translator, but I'm pretty sure they would choose that work because they also love it. So it becomes maybe a conversation amongst 3 people, the original author and the translator and yourself. That's the same as when you have an actual conversation with someone in a different language from yourself. It's a translator who is helping you so you can have that conversation. And translation is just really important these days, I think, because there's so many languages in the world and there's so many different people to talk to that it's just amazing. So that's all. Thanks. Bye, BookTube.